can join the webcast today. We'll be right back online very soon. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to another DAP webinar series, Misunderstood Metrics. My name is Freddie Blicker. I am an analyst with the DAP program at the GSA. Today I am joined by Tim Loudon, who's the program manager of the DAP program. Also want to give a big shout out and thank you to the DigitalGov team for their help in this webcast recording. Today, we're going to be talking about misunderstood metrics. We have a chat function, so if you have any questions as we go through this material, we highly encourage you to submit those questions via chat. Tim will be monitoring the chat, and then we will answer those questions to the best of our ability at the end of today's webcast. One item to note, at the end of today's webcast, we would really appreciate it if you fill out the survey. We greatly appreciate any feedback, any comments, any thoughts that you have on how these webinars really help you do better with Google Analytics in your day-to-day job. We certainly appreciate that feedback and look forward to receiving it. We're always trying to improve and make sure that you have relevant training material to support you in your Google Analytics journey. With that, I will jump into the webcast today. So today's webcast is about misunderstood metrics. Now, this is a complex topic. Really, this webcast is geared towards novice DAP users. So if you're like most brand new DAP users, you probably feel like this guy. You probably feel overwhelmed by all the different metrics available in reporting. Tim and I realize this. This is challenging stuff. Analytics is challenging. So we are here to hopefully help you better understand some of the most common misunderstood metrics so that you're able to take this back and better use your data to glean insights about your specific sites. So what's our challenge? Interpreting data in Google Analytics is already tough enough. On top of that, we have to deal with very complicated concepts, primarily metrics. Now, a lot of people make assumptions about metrics based on what their names are. So for example, average session duration. One might assume what that means just by virtue of what words are actually used to describe that metric. But that's not necessarily the case. So a major pitfall that we all run into in Google Analytics is misinterpreting these metrics, misinterpreting your data. Now, this gets really problematic when you're trying to create your quarterly reports or your weekly reports and trying to communicate the influence of your website on your audience or on UX, whatever the case may be. Understanding what the data actually means and then communicating that to your stakeholders, that's really tough. So we all have a regular reporting that our stakeholders ask for, and more than likely you will get very tough questions about what it means. So we're going to hopefully help demystify some of this for you today. Now, our main challenge is to help synthesize some of the more complex topics so that we can help you pull the correct data so that you understand how to improve your website experience for the public. You know, we can't do these things if we're misinterpreting data. Okay, so why we're here today. Like I mentioned before, today's webinar is really geared towards the novice DAP user. Now, it's really easy to go down the rabbit hole on metrics in DAP Google Analytics. Tim and I did that preparing for this webcast ourselves. You know, we like to tell folks that we learn something new every day, and that's certainly true for this webcast. There is always something new that we're learning, and so we're hopefully going to help you learn some new things today as well. What we're going to do today is really avoid going down the rabbit hole, since this is really geared towards more novice, new DAP users, and we're going to keep this simple, high level, and contextual to the federal government audience. So we're going to try to demystify some of the most commonly misinterpreted metrics to help you better understand your data so that you can report with confidence. So I'd like folks on this webcast today to think to yourself as we go through the material today. Two main questions. What value does our reporting provide if we're misinterpreting data? And how do we infer trends from that data if we're actually misinterpreting that data? Those are two really important questions. If you misinterpret data from your reporting, you're not going to be telling an accurate story about engagement on your website. So we're going to hopefully help demystify some of this today. So the format for today, we're going to be talking about a number of frequently misunderstood metrics terminology. This is definitely not every misunderstood metric. We only have about 55 minutes for today's webcast. But the format that I'm going to use today is talking about what is the metric, how is it calculated, how is it misinterpreted, and then what does this actually mean to you in terms of what you need to be aware of when you actually do reporting. So that's the format. So let's jump in. Before jumping into the specific misinterpreted metrics, I want to briefly talk about scope. We have a link in here to our previous webcast where we spoke about scope and all you need to know about scope in Google Analytics. So I want to revisit that concept here because it is very important. Now, what is scope? So for the new folks on this webcast who have not attended one of our previous webcasts, I'm just going to basically describe one of the more complicated concepts in Google Analytics. So scope is how Google Analytics collects and formats your Google Analytics data for dimensions and metrics. Now, for the new folks here, dimensions are simply a descriptor of your data. Metrics are the numbers. So we're primarily going to be talking about the numbers today, the metrics. Now, in terms of scope, what this means is that Google collects dimension and metric data in different buckets. So not only is it really easy to misinterpret metrics in Google Analytics, but it's also very easy to combine the wrong metrics with the wrong dimensions because of scope. I know most folks on this webcast are probably thinking, wow, that's challenging. Now, most of the time, you'll run into issues combining these different buckets of scope. So let's talk a little bit about that. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do think it's worthwhile revisiting before we actually jump into the different metrics that we're going to be talking about today. So let's visually remind ourselves about what we chatted about on the last webcast that we talked about with scope. Now, on this slide, you see the buckets. You see the user, the session, and the hit buckets of data, of dimensions and metrics. So this is a visual of how scope works. So Google Analytics collects and processes data in a user bucket. So this is typically made up of one or more sessions. Sessions are made up of one or more hits, and then hits are multiple and occur on each page load or event. Hits are the building blocks of Google Analytics. They contain a bunch of site info, and they're basically sent to the Google Analytics server. Now, let's focus our attention on the user bucket in gray. Now, you'll notice certain dimensions and metrics appear here. We've got city, gender, users, new users. When you drill down into the session buckets in tan, we've got landing page, source medium, sessions, bounce rate. And then in blue, in the hit level buckets, we have page, event category, page view, and so on. This is how Google Analytics collects and processes the data. And so you really need to be aware of what types of dimensions you're combining with what types of metrics, because you can't combine them all. And that's kind of part of half the battle with understanding a lot of these misinterpreted metrics, is how do we even combine these into reporting? So you need to be very cognizant of how to do that. Now, in terms of scope, I like to tell folks that there is a rule of thumb, and I want to tell you all that there is a rule of thumb as we go through metrics today. Use the Google Analytics standard reports as your guide to figuring out which dimensions and metrics you can combine in reporting. Now, I'm sure folks on this call today are all familiar with the landing pages report. I have a screenshot here. Now, if I ever have a question about what types of dimensions I can combine with what types of metrics, I will go literally through the different reports to see how Google is presenting that data in the standard reports. Now, on this screen right now is a snippet of a landing page report. Now you see that landing page here out of the box is listed. You see the gsa.gov is the #1 result there that I've filtered for. And then you see sessions by default is included in this report. Now, if you go to any other report, Google Analytics is automatically going to group together the dimensions and metrics that you're allowed to put together in the same type of report. So use Google Analytics standard reports as your roadmap for figuring out which metrics go with which dimensions. Okay. The first metric we'd like to discuss today is sessions. Now, on the surface, this probably seems like a pretty simple one, right? But it's not actually that simple when you actually dive into it. So this is a fundamental metric that we all need to be aware of about how it works. So let's talk about sessions. What is it? A session is simply all the activity a user performs on your site during a 30-minute period of time that restarts with each action they take. So you can think of a session as a container for all the actions a user takes on your site. Now, in this little screenshot that we have here, this is an example of a session. In the green boxes, these are 2 pages that somebody has viewed. In the orange box, these are 2 events somebody has interacted with specific pieces of content. That could be a PDF download. You could also have an event for a social interaction in purple. You could also have a transaction in red. All of this engagement by a user is included in one session. Let's talk about how a session is calculated. So typically, a user will enter a website. Upon entering that site, they land on a page. That page executes the Google Analytics JavaScript tracking code. A session begins on a landing page from the time a user lands on that page until either the clock strikes midnight Eastern time for the DAP account. Now, I should note, if you use an independently managed Google Analytics account for your specific agency outside of DAP, sessions restart at midnight based on the time zone your account is set to. So if you, for whatever reason, have it set to Pacific Standard, that's when the session will end, 12 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. But from a DAP account perspective, ours is 12 a.m. Eastern. Let's continue talking about when the session ends. The second way a session ends is if a user changes their campaign source. We'll talk a little bit about that later. That's a more complicated topic. But most importantly, a session will end when there's 30 minutes of inactivity. So let me go back to my previous slide and just look at the session diagram here. So the idea is, let's say you enter a website, you land on a landing page, and then you look at some different pieces of content. If you leave your browser window open and then you go grab a coffee for 10 minutes, you come back, you're still within that 30-minute session window. You have not had inactivity for 30 minutes. And so what you pick up and end up browsing after you get your coffee is still lumped in to that one original session. Now, there are additional caveats with this that we'll talk to in just a few slides. So, how is sessions misinterpreted? Well, the biggest one that we see is pulling sessions by the wrong dimension. Now, remember, in this screenshot here that I took, we see landing page combined with sessions from Google Analytics out-of-the-box standard reports. This is our roadmap. What I often see folks do is pulling in a page dimension. This is different from a landing page. A session starts on a landing page. A session does not start on a regular page dimension. So you cannot use page dimension with sessions or you will get incorrect data. Now, the challenge with Google Analytics is that Google does allow you to combine metrics and dimensions from different scopes in custom reports. So even though it's wrong, Google allows you to pull in the page dimension with sessions in a custom report. So you just have to be very wary about how you put these reports together and how you're combining metrics with dimensions. Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit more about how sessions are misinterpreted. So let's talk about one example. So what happens if during a session to my website, Bob leaves open a page while he takes a 31-minute lunch break, then returns to continue browsing the site? Well, let's take a look at what this looks like. In the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, you'll see there are two sessions. So Bob starts browsing page 1 and then page 2. This is happening in one session. Now, after browsing page 2, Bob leaves for lunch. He leaves this browser window open. He comes back from lunch after 31 minutes. Then he continues browsing page 3 and page 4. However, the session, his first session, ended after 30 minutes during Bob's lunch. Now, after Bob's lunch, a new session begins. The second session captures his interactivity with page 3 and page 4. So now Bob has two different sessions where he's browsing the same website and different content. Let's go on to another example. What happens if Bob leaves open a page on my site but only takes a 29-minute lunch break before he continues browsing? Now, in the screenshot here, we see that Bob views page view 1, and then he views the second page, and he leaves for lunch with this page open in his browser. He only takes a 29-minute lunch break, so he comes back before the 30-minute cap on inactivity. He continues browsing. Page 3 and page 4 then get lumped in the same session. So that's challenging. That can be confusing, but you need to be aware of these caveats. There's a lot of caveats in Google Analytics. Okay. Now, there is one additional edge case that's not really applicable to DAP users. This is more for the private sector, but we definitely want to make sure that you're aware that this exists, but don't worry about this one too much. Now, there is a scenario where, let's say Bob opens your website and searches for red widgets on Google search results, clicks into your site, then decides to leave, and then he searches for blue widgets and then comes back to your site via a paid ad. This changes the campaign and ends the previous session and begins a new one. So this is usually tied to users clicking on advertising, so paid ads. Since we don't have a ton of sites using ads, don't worry about this, but this is a caveat that we as analysts all need to be aware of. You will typically not see this in DAP data. I don't recommend worrying about this edge case since most government websites are not using paid search. Okay, so these are some interesting situations, right, that we need to be aware of. We need to be aware of the technical aspects of this. So what does this actually mean for me as a DAP user? Well, I recommend folks not assume that all website activity by one user occurred in only one session. Now, just to kind of reiterate what we talked about, sessions end after 30 minutes of inactivity or at midnight. Bob can start browsing a site and then take a 29-minute lunch break and then pick right back up where he was browsing in the same session. Or Bob can start browsing a site and then take a 31-minute lunch break and pick back up on the same site, but in a different session. That's a mouthful. The main implication here is that in reporting, you can't accurately create the full user journey because oftentimes the user journey is split among multiple sessions. Think about how many tabs you have open in your browser looking at different pages on the same site. Imagine how much noise that introduces in the journey flow through a website. Imagine how that gets split up into different sessions or in the same session, depending on how long you leave your browser window inactive. So there's a lot of noise that can happen there. Now, different sessions can contain different parts of the same user journey, so you just need to be aware of that. Our advice, report on sessions, but understand the caveats. Okay. The next metric that we're going to talk about, this one is very often misunderstood, and we get contacted very often by a number of folks who use DAP. So we definitely wanted to help clear up this misunderstood metric, and that metric is users. So let's talk about that. What is a user? A user is simply a person who visits a site or app. Now, how is a user calculated? Well, a cookie that stores an anonymous Google Analytics client ID is placed in the browser, and that defines a user. Now, there are some challenges with this. Users can be misinterpreted. Now, in this example that we have here, Bob browses gsa.gov on his work computer, then on his smartphone, and then on his tablet. Now, for folks on this webcast, please use the chat function to let me know how many users do you think Bob is here. If he's using his desktop, his smartphone, and his tablet computers, how many users is Bob? We'll give it about 10 seconds. And Tim, if you could let me know if anyone is chatting in there, that would be great.
People are being a little shy today.
Okay.
Okay, we've got a few now. Some people say 3, some people say 1, some people say 1 if it's in the same network.
Interesting.
Most folks are saying 3.
Great. Well, that is great to hear. So the answer is 3. So there are 3 different users counted for Bob, who is one person. So Google Analytics places a cookie on every device. So the cookie defines the user, and because each device has a separate cookie, Bob is actually considered to be 3 people in terms of Google Analytics. So great job to folks who knew this answer. This is definitely one of the more complicated and misunderstood metrics. Let's talk a little bit more about what this means for me. Now, not only are you double or possibly triple counting users, but more recently, Apple has released an intelligent tracking protocol 2.1 for all of their Safari browsers. So the Safari browser is the primary browser on iPhones, on iPads, on MacBooks. Now, this new tracking protocol now limits cookies, which define the user, to 7 days. Now, because of ITP 2.1, after 7 days, your cookies get blown away and you're now considered a new user. So what does this mean? Well, this significantly impacts your user data and reporting. Now, on average, we typically see anywhere from 20 to 30% of all traffic originating on Safari browsers. Now, you can just imagine that's a big chunk of traffic. And if those cookies are expiring after 7 days, you're going to have a lot more users showing up in your reporting. So the main takeaway here is there are a number of technical issues that affect how users are defined in Google Analytics. It affects the volume of users collected, and it affects whether you're seeing more new users in your data. The users metric will never be an entirely accurate measure because of this. So it will never accurately measure the number of people browsing your site. So you need to be aware of these caveats. Now, additionally, the users metric is even less meaningful in light of this intelligent tracking protocol in Safari browsers. Now, we do understand that there are certain situations where folks may want to report on new users versus returning users or just users overall. Typically, you're going to have to explain these caveats to your stakeholders about what is a user and how is it defined. So that's part of the challenge with this. Again, users is not representative of actual people browsing your site. Now, our advice for this misunderstood metric is to consider not reporting on new versus returning users, because as you saw, when the cookies expire after 7 days, you're going to have a ton more new users. That's not going to look or make sense in your reports. Now, we recommend reporting on the percentage increase or decrease in the total volume of users. So not looking at new versus returning, but rather just looking at the percentage increase or decrease in total volume of users. Okay, let's move on to the next misunderstood metric. So let's talk about average time on page. Now, what is average time on page? So this is simply the average time spent reading on a page. You'll typically see this metric combined with the page dimension in the all pages report in standard reports. Now, how is this collected? So basically, Google calculates this as time on page divided by page views minus exits. Now, in terms of how Google Analytics calculates time on page, Google is always looking at the next page viewed to calculate the time on page of the current page being viewed. So there needs to be a next page that is viewed to capture the actual time spent on a page. So let's unpack this a little bit more. This is definitely a metric that is very misinterpreted by a number of folks. So let's kind of visualize this together. Now, in this particular scenario, a user reads 2 pages, but Google Analytics only counts time for page 1. So let's figure out how that works. Okay, so in the gray box on the left-hand side of the screen, there is currently 0 time recorded when a user is looking at the first page on a site. So there is no time on page calculated until the user navigates to a second page. So let's pretend this user navigates to a second page. So in the gray box in the middle of my slide, this shows the user navigating to page 2 after having viewed page 1 for 30 seconds. So now that the user has moved on to page 2 after 30 seconds, Google Analytics records 30 seconds recorded for time on page for viewing page 1. Now, in this scenario, let's say the user reads page 2 for 45 seconds. Then the user leaves. In this situation, Google Analytics records 0 seconds, even though the user read page 2 for 45 seconds. So you should, in theory, have 75 seconds recorded, right? But Google Analytics only recorded 30 seconds time on page for page 1. Now, again, let's revisit why that is. Because the user left page 2, just left the site, there's no page 3 that Google uses to timestamp how long you actually read page 2. So Google can't record time on page for page 2 because they left. Challenging concept. Let's dig into this a little bit more. So on the last page view, Google is not able to calculate the time for a final page because there is no final page to timestamp. Now, what this means is that time on page of the last page viewed is unknown, and so Google simply records it as 0. Now, Google does not include the 0 value in its calculations. So that's one important thing to note here. For time on page, Google does not record the 0 value in its calculations for time on page. Now, when a page is the exit page, Google is not recording any time for that exit page. Now, this has the effect of removing bounces, the effect of bounces on time on page. Now, bounces affect average time on page because there's simply less data recorded. There's no final page to timestamp, so there's simply no data recorded. So what does this mean for me as a DAP user? Well, in light of this interesting aspect of average time on page, you really need to be super careful about how you interpret average time on page. It does not mean that you're getting the average time on page for literally every page viewed in a session. Additionally, you need to use average time on page with the page dimension. If you look in the all pages report, you'll see the page dimension. Average time on page will be available in that specific report. So as you're going through trying to use average time on page to understand the engagement with your content, you have to think to yourself, time on page will always be 0 for pages where the user exited the site when there was no next page viewed. There is simply no data recorded. So you need to take this data with a grain of salt. Now, there is an interesting way for you to think about this misunderstood metric. So if the page you're pulling in your reporting has 0 time on page, you can investigate this. You can look at a specific page's exit rate in Google Analytics. So couple thoughts here. If a page has a high exit rate, then the average time on page will generally be less reliable. That's because Google is unable to timestamp that final page. So there's not going to be data in your calculations. Now, if a page has a low exit rate, you can reasonably trust the average time on page metric, because in this scenario, you're not seeing as many bounces from, or as many exits from the last page. And so there's data included in this calculation. There's more data included in this calculation. All right, so that was a lot. Let's now continue looking at average session duration. Now, this is different from average time on page. Now, average session duration is a misunderstood metric that you typically see in the landing pages reports. This is session-based. Now, average session duration is the top-level view of how long average users spend browsing your site. How is this calculated? Well, this is slightly different from time on page. It's calculated like so: session duration divided by sessions. Now let's talk about how this is misinterpreted. Now, session duration does not ignore exit pages like time on page does. That's particularly important to note as you go through understanding these different metrics. Average session duration does not ignore exit pages in their calculations like time on page does. So average session duration includes the 0 data. So what this does in effect is that this decreases the average session duration. Now, the average session duration for a bounce on a page is 0, and this will be included in the calculations for average session duration. Now, bounce rate decreases with average session duration. It is possible to find a situation where you have a really low average session duration for a site with lots of bounces, but this is not going to be very common. All you need to really kind of remember as you go through this is that highly bounced landing pages will have a low average session duration. Now, this is a lot. This is complicated, right? Trying to figure out which metric to use in which particular situation is a challenge. So what does this mean for me? Well, like with time on page, average session duration seemingly on the surface literally means what you think it would mean, but that's not actually the case. So you really need to be careful and aware about the caveats of using average session duration. The main takeaway here is that Google includes the zero data from bounces in your reporting. So it's a different methodology. It's a different calculation from time on page. Now, I like to tell folks who ask, how do I decide to choose which one? Well, I think you need to go back to what question you're trying to answer about your content engagement. What are your goals? What is your content trying to do to get your users to take certain goals on your website? You need to figure out why you want to use average session duration before you report on it. And once you report on it, you also need to be aware of how you're going to have to explain this, because it's not as seemingly easy as the actual term would be. There's a lot baked into this. That's what makes this really challenging. Okay, let's talk about another misunderstood metric. Let's talk about bounce rate. So what is bounce rate? Bounce rate is a single page session on your site. How is bounce rate calculated? Well, the calculation is such. Total number of bounces on a page divided by total number of entrances. So let's talk a little bit about the terminology here. So what is a bounce? A bounce is the number of single page visits where only one tracking request is made to Google Analytics. So if you think about that, you land on a page on a website and then you leave. That's a bounce. Now, what is an entrance? An entrance is simply the number of times a user entered your site on a specific page. So a bounce rate is looking at the relationship between bounces and entrances to understand the rate at which your traffic bounces away from your site, right? It's looking at a single page session on your site. So bounce rate, there's a lot of misinterpretation around this particular metric. So let's talk a little bit about this. So with a bounce rate, a user enters your site, lands on a page, and then leaves. So in this particular screenshot here, this is considered a bounce, and this is actually included in the bounce rate calculation. Makes sense, right? I think we all know what bounce rates are fundamentally. It's a user landing on a page and then leaving. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated when we're trying to interpret very specific scenarios. Now, before we jump into those scenarios, let's talk a little bit about events. Now, events are simply interactions with different pieces of content. You can have PDF download events, you can have webcast download events, button clicks, outbound links, all of these things that DAP automatically tracks with event reporting. Now, there are two types of events, and these two types of events impact bounce rate. So let's dig into these a little bit. Now, the most common type of event is the interaction event. Now, by default, DAP is tracking all of these. As I mentioned before, these are things like downloads, outbound links, etc. Now, there's another type called a non-interaction event. You need to specially program these to register an event as a non-interaction. Now, typically you'll see non-interaction events used when, let's say you're browsing a website and there's a little chat window that magically appears before you, and it has somebody typing in the box asking you if they can help you find something. Typically, you would register that as a non-interaction type of event. So it's very different from actually clicking on something and downloading it or clicking on an outbound link. So those are the two different types of events that you can, in theory, track in Google Analytics. Most of the time in DAP, it's going to be interaction events, but there are non-interaction events that you could, in theory, implement. Now, these types of events are going to impact bounce rate. So let's look into how that happens. So in this scenario, we're going to talk about interaction events and how they affect bounce rate. Now, remember, interaction events are things like PDF downloads, outbound link clicks, etc. So let's say we have a scenario where the user lands on the site, views a page, and then downloads a PDF and then leaves the site. They seemingly bounce. However, because an interaction event took place, this bounce is no longer considered a bounce and is not factored or calculated into the bounce rate. So in effect, an interaction event negates the bounce that occurred. Now, let's look at another example. Let's talk about non-interaction events. Now, these are typically going to be, like I mentioned before, captured for things like little chat box windows that get magically displayed to you when you enter a website and somebody's asking you if they can help you. That's a non-interaction event. Now, let's talk about how these affect bounce rate. Now, the use case is a user lands on a site, is presented with a chat window where the site records that chat window event as a non-interaction event. Then the user leaves the site, so they seemingly bounce. Now, because a non-interaction event was used, this bounce is still considered a bounce and is factored into bounce rate. So that's the distinction between interaction and non-interaction events and how they impact bounce rate. So the main takeaway from non-interaction events is that they do not negate the bounce. Okay, let's continue on and look at another scenario. Now, in this particular scenario, a user lands on a site and then the user leaves the site. The user viewed only one page. Now, for example, if your developer has accidentally implemented the DAP script twice so that there are now two tracking requests with the same DAP UAID being sent to Google Analytics, this is a problem. You're actually recording two page views with the same UAID. So now, because it is now two page views, this is not considered a bounce, even though seemingly on the surface to the end user, they are bouncing. They are leaving the site. It's from a Google Analytics perspective, because the UAID is being sent twice to Google Analytics, it is not considered a bounce and it is not factored into bounce rate. Now, there's also the issue of double counting your data because you're firing two UAID requests with these two page views. This is going to double count your data, and obviously that's not a good thing. Okay, so just to summarize bounce rate, how it's misinterpreted. So you can have a couple different scenarios that really impact how your bounce rate is affected. So first, UAID fires twice. It's captured as two pages. It's no longer a single page session, right? In addition to that, you're double counting your data. If you're capturing events on every page, you'll see a lower bounce rate, especially if they're interaction events. Now, interaction events will affect your bounce rate. Non-interaction events will not affect your bounce rate. Okay, so that was a lot of material. For this particular type of webcast, this is challenging stuff because we're trying to help a lot of the novice DAP users new to the platform to understand kind of the ins and outs of a lot of the misinterpreted metrics. Now, these are not all of the misinterpreted metrics that are out there. There are many more. Now, I'm sure you probably feel like you kind of knew in the back of your mind that there were these types of misinterpretations out there, but you didn't really know how deep it goes. That's okay. We are there with you. We're learning new things every day about a lot of these metrics, but we're here to help you understand how to interpret these metrics so that you don't misinterpret these types of things in your day-to-day reporting. Now, a couple takeaways here. As we've seen with these metrics, there are a lot of different caveats. There are a lot of different, very specific scenarios in which you need to be aware about how these metrics are calculated and what impacts these metrics. Now, the metrics seemingly on the surface seem to mean what the actual words are to describe them. So average session duration on the surface sounds just like what it is, but it is not in the world of Google Analytics. That's the challenge that we're up against. So the big takeaway from today is you need to really be careful of pitfalls in misinterpreting your data. There's always going to be more than meets the eye in how you need to interpret these metrics. And I'll leave you with one final parting thought today. Really leverage the standard reports as your roadmap to figure out, number one, which metrics go with which dimensions so that you're able to understand the context around how to interpret these metrics. Now, we've covered a lot of metrics today. Sessions, bounce rate, average time on page, average session duration. These are super important metrics to use in your daily reporting. There's a lot that goes into calculating these, and there's a lot to be aware of as we go through and understand how these metrics impact our reporting, how to interpret them, and then how to report out on them to our stakeholders. Tim, do we have any questions in the chat window?
Oh, we have had a riveting discussion over in the chat side. A bunch of people have been commenting and asking questions.
Oh, great.
I certainly think I answered a few of them in there, but I certainly think a few of these are probably worth bringing up to the greater group. I know some people cannot use the chat function because sometimes you need to create accounts. So I'll just kind of touch on some of the things here. So one of the first questions we got was regarding the Safari ITP 2.1 change. And the question was, do we anticipate other browsers to make changes similar to what Safari's done? I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I can speak to that. Yeah, that's a great question. I am not aware. I have not heard of any other changes like that. You know, it's really kind of a moving target. You know, ITP 2.1 is a very new thing. It's a very new concept that came out this year. So I think we're all kind of grappling with this in the analytics industry. But, you know, whether Google will make a similar change, we just don't know. You know, a lot of this is really a black box. I mean, we don't have really any way of truly knowing what's coming down the pipeline in terms of how, you know, users' privacy is going to be protected using different technologies like this. So unfortunately, that has the downstream impact on us as analysts on how we pull reporting, interpret reporting, and obviously with the users metric, it really renders it you know, very difficult to use in our day-to-day reporting.
Yeah, I mean, I can say from my perspective, I have heard rumblings that other browsers could potentially follow suit, but Freddie's right. We don't have any solid knowledge of any of the development teams at Chrome or Firefox or anything, or what they plan on doing. One point that it might be good to make that I also sort of made in the chat section here was that, you know, despite the fact that for analysts this is a bit of a thorn in our side, the cookie expiration at 7 days, the reason why Safari did it, or WebKit actually made the change which powers Safari, was related to user privacy and trying to stop marketing firms from taking long periods of time with a cookie to build profiles with which to target you for ads. So I think, you know, on the whole, the premise of it is a positive. It just unfortunately has ramifications for us. let's see here. So another question was, prior to when Safari enacted ITP 2.1, which I think was in April of this year, this person asked, was there a cookie limit then, and how long was the old limit?
Got it. So not specifically for the Safari browser. So before ITP 2.1, the Safari browser acted in much the same way that Chrome or any other browser collects cookies, right? So the kind of general timeout for Google Analytics cookies is 24 months. So, you know, in terms of Safari kind of stepping up how quickly cookies expire, that's pretty notable. So
Going
yeah,
from 2 years to 7 days. That's
exactly. Yeah, that will definitely have an impact on your user count data for sure.
For sure. We had a couple people kind of asking, you know, with regard to the stuff that you were talking about regarding the timestamp concept and the exit page not being recorded. Some folks kind of said, and I think you kind of stated this in your slide, but just to reiterate, they're saying if you have a very high bounce or exit rate for a specific page, is the average time on page number useless?
That is a great question. So let me quickly review, just for everyone on the webcast, kind of the main concepts here. So with average time on page, when you have a page that's the exit page, Google records no time for that exit page. So that a zero value is not recorded. So this removes the effect of bounces. So bounces affect average time on page because there's less data recorded. Now with average session duration, when you have an exit, there is, it does include the zero data. So the last page also doesn't have a time associated with it. But the bounce rate in terms of, you know, average session duration will decrease the total average session duration. So there are some very fine caveats here between these two kind of concepts. Tim, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Basically, they were just saying, if we have a very high bounce rate, does it render the average time on page for that page completely useless?
Yeah, I mean, for average time on page, if there is a very high bounce rate, there's not going to be zero. Well, there will be zero time recorded, and so that will render time on page significantly lower. So that is a challenge. So again, it's splitting hairs. It's very challenging, but it's definitely something to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, I think just to clarify, the bounces they don't, for the time on page, the zero isn't figured into the calculation because the calculation removes the exit pages, but you'll have less data. If you have a 98% bounce rate for a particular page, you'd only have 2% where you'd actually have some time on page. And so depending on what your bounce rate is, you really have to do some math to figure it out if it's statistically significant, or, you know, or if it's something that maybe you don't want to look at. So that was a good question and a good clarification. Let's see here. Dun, 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 dun. Someone said, you mentioned you'll get bad data if you use page dimension with, it says if you use a page report for a landing page. I think this is more related to scope. And so the person, I think what they were getting at was, if you use a dimension such as page, which is hit level, with a metric that is a different scope, let's say a session, how does that skew data?
Yeah, that's a great question. So simply with the page being a hit level dimension, it is not designed, Google is not capturing sessions because they do not occur on pages. So a session occurs and starts capturing data when a user lands on a landing page. And so fundamentally, you cannot combine certain dimensions and metrics in Google Analytics because they're just not designed to go together. So they're captured in different ways, in different buckets, as Google is capturing all of this data about your session. So that's why you cannot combine page dimension with sessions.
Yeah, it ends up recording, the sessions will be lower than the actual amount of sessions if you use page with it.
Right.
Another question here, and actually I kind of had a bit of a light bulb moment while you were talking here, Freddie, as I was kind of looking things as well. But somebody asked here, assuming no inactivity for 30 minutes or longer, session lengths aren't capped other than the reset at midnight, correct? And if it's cool with you, Freddie, I could try to take this one.
Yeah, please.
So it's really complicated, but basically, as Freddie noted, the ways that a session gets ended is with inactivity for 30 minutes, or the reset at midnight, or a campaign source change. And that topic is kind of complicated, but I think I have a pretty firm grasp on it at this point. And basically, the reason they say that is a referral from another site back to your site will start a new session. So if, for example, you are on USA.gov and you click a link and it takes you to USA Jobs, and then you click on a link that takes you back to USA Gov. If that was a referral from USA Jobs, it will start a new session. But where this gets interesting is that a direct traffic never changes the previous campaign source. So what that means is if you went to Google and you got to USA.gov from Google, and then you basically closed out of that tab, but you copy and pasted the link, and then you directly put that link back into the URL bar and got back to USA.gov, and it's within the 30 minutes, because that was direct traffic, you don't overwrite the campaign, and the session will actually pick up where you left off. It's a very weird concept, but basically that's it. Direct traffic will continue a session if it's not within 30 minutes. Most other situations where someone leaves the site and comes back, you'll have a different campaign referral, and so it won't pick up the session. But it's a little nuts. We have a couple minutes left, and questions keep on coming in. So
awesome.
Clarification on bounces. If any other event is triggered while on page, it's not counted as a bounce. Okay, that person has that. But is the event used to calculate the time on page, or is it removed from the bounces? I think the question here is, if you have an event, does that figure into calculating time on page? That's a good question.
That is a good question.
I don't think it does, because an event could happen and someone could stay on a page. And so while you have a timestamp for when the event fired, you could still be on the page. Oh, Pure Fairy, whoever Pure Fairy is in the chat box is saying it is used for time on page. Pure Fairy, you need to come on, and we need to book you for our next webinar. But I can take a look at this and make sure, but in my mind, I'm pretty sure, because you could fire an event and then stay on the page, it probably wouldn't be the particular one.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Tim.
But we're going to follow up on that, and we can send it in the follow-up email. Okay, with that, I think we're at 2:58. We should probably try to wrap up. Thank you all for the great conversation in the chat.
Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone, for your questions, and really, really insightful. Great. Well, thank you all for attending today's webcast. We always enjoy doing these. We would definitely appreciate your feedback on this type of format. If you're interested in additional webcasts that talk about more misunderstood metrics, that might be something that we focus on in the future. So there will be a survey going out. Please, by all means, send us your feedback. You will also be receiving, after this presentation, a link to the deck and to the YouTube video. And wanted to thank Tim for manning the chat box and for the DGU team's help in setting up and helping us run this webcast today. And thank you all for attending, and we look forward to helping you out in future webcasts on new topics in the future.